Welcome back to Midnight Outcry, everyone. We're taking you on a terrifying journey along some of America's most haunted highways tonight, sharing 10 true tales of trucker terror that will change the way you view those lonely roads. These reports are based on first-hand reports from long-distance drivers who have experienced an inexplicable phenomenon on some of the most isolated highways in our country. Every story is a documented encounter with the forces that patrol America's highways after midnight, whether it's the ghostly hitchhikers of Interstate 80 or the time-warping loops of US 50. Instead of urban legends passed down through coffee shop conversations, these incidents, which trucking companies would prefer to keep hidden, are supported by dashcam evidence, CB radio records, and official incident reports. These reports, which imply that some roads never fully rest, are especially unsettling because they are consistent across decades and thousands of miles of highway. If you're new here, subscribe to Midnight Outcry for daily real horror content that explores the darkest secrets concealed in plain sight. Press the alert button to ensure you don't miss the moment when we reveal America's darkest secrets. Now let us unite on the highways where reality crumbles and the unlikely becomes inevitable, where every checkpoint might be your last. The National Weather Service did not issue any advisories for Interstate 80 that evening. The weather reports were clear skies that seemed to stretch forever over the Nevada desert and consistently pleasant temperatures of 62 degrees. There was more than 10 miles of visibility. It should have been just another typical drive from Salt Lake City to Reno for 34-year-old Marcus Rodriguez, a veteran of American roads with 12 years of spotless driving records. His 2018 Peterbilt 579 hummed softly along the well-known stretch of tarmac, immaculately maintained and outfitted with every safety feature the company could afford. He had made over 200 trips. Preparation was something Marcus had always taken great pride in. His clear logbook entries, which covered everything from weather patterns to fuel consumption rates, were renowned by dispatchers. At precisely 9:47 p.m. that October evening, he had registered his departure from the Salt Lake terminal. He is traveling to California in a trailer loaded with electronics. He had muscle memory of the route. I-80 west through the Salt Flats, past Wendover, into the Sierra Nevada mountains and across the Nevada desert. Between Utah and California, he was familiar with every mile marker, every way station, and every truck stop. Marcus reached mile marker 45 close to the small desert town of Hawk at 11:43 p.m., 4 minutes ahead of schedule. With only his LED headlights piercing the night, the highway loomed before him like a ribbon of black glass. He was mostly alone with his thoughts and the steady rhythm of his diesel engine, though occasionally his CB radio buzzed with distant conversations from other drivers. He saw her for the first time then. An old woman appeared in his headlights close to mile marker 48 at precisely 11:47 p.m., as indicated by the digital clock on his truck. With her other hand gripping what looked like a small piece of luggage, she stood on the side of the road, with one arm extended in the universal sign for help. As Marcus engaged the brakes, his heart began to race. About 50 yards past her location, the massive truck's air brakes hissed as he brought 18 tons of steel and goods to a controlled stop. Although business protocol strongly discouraged it, Marcus had previously picked up stranded drivers. But there was something strange about this woman. Wearing a cream-colored outfit that seemed strangely formal for a midnight desert road, she looked to be in her 70s. Even though she should have been windblown from standing by the freeway, her gray hair was styled nicely. Despite the intense beam of his headlights, she did not cast any shadows as he approached her after getting out of his taxi. She whispered, "Thank you for stopping, dear," with a remarkable clarity that seemed to pierce the stillness of the desert. Her accent was vaguely European, possibly German, as she said, "I have been waiting so a long time." Marcus noticed that her teeth were remarkably straight and white when she smiled, which was unusual for someone her age. Marcus searched the roadside for indications of a broken-down vehicle and asked, "What happened to your car, ma'am?" There was nothing. No car, no truck, no motorcycle, just empty desert stretching in all directions. "Oh, there was an accident," she said, shifting her grip on the suitcase. "It was a long time ago, but It was such a terrible accident. I have to visit my daughter in Reno. She will be extremely anxious." Marcus ascribed the woman's eyes' peculiar appearance, which seemed to reflect light like an animal, to the angle of his headlights. Marcus found himself agreeing to give her a ride, even though every safety precaution was screaming against it. His professional caution was overridden by something about her manner, her evident sadness. Despite the warm desert air, he noticed that her hand felt oddly cold as he pulled her up into the passenger seat of his cab. She was nearly weightless, as though she were made of air instead of flesh and bone. The woman started talking about Reno as they turned back onto the highway, describing buildings and streets with a startling level of accuracy. As though it were still in operation, she made reference to the old Mapes Hotel, which had been closed since 2000. She mentioned visiting her daughter by train. Marcus found her stories intriguing, albeit a little confused, and described her apparent time displacement to age and stress from whatever tragedy had left her stranded, despite the fact that passenger rail service to Reno had been discontinued decades earlier. At mile marker 68, 20 miles later, she abruptly gestured to the right side of the road. "Sweetheart, you must slow down here. Beyond that curve lies black ice. Extremely dangerous for a large truck like yours." Marcus checked his thermometer. The temperature was 64 degrees, which is much too warm for the formation of ice. Nevertheless, he eased off the throttle because of something in her voice, an urgency that had not been present before. "Ma'am, it is too warm for ice tonight," he said gently, not wanting to contradict her, but feeling the need to explain the impossibility of her warning. "No, dear," she insisted, her voice now carrying a strange echo. "Trust me, I have seen what happens when drivers do not listen." As she spoke, Marcus glanced at his passenger seat and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The seat was empty. The elderly woman had vanished completely, leaving behind only the faintest scent of old-fashioned perfume in a small wet spot on the seat where she had been sitting. Marcus slammed on his brakes, his mind reeling. He had been talking to her just seconds before. She could not have simply disappeared from a moving truck cab 60 feet above the ground. He pulled over immediately, searching every inch of his cab with a flashlight. Nothing. No sign that anyone had ever been there, except for that damp spot on the passenger seat and the lingering scent of lilacs. Shaken but determined to reach his destination, Marcus pulled back onto the highway. As he approached the curve she had warned him about, his headlights revealed something that made his hands tremble on the steering wheel. A thin sheet of black ice covered the asphalt for nearly a 4-mile, invisible until the light hit it at just the right angle. At the speed he had been traveling, his loaded truck would have jackknifed immediately, likely sending him over the embankment into the desert below. He navigated the ice carefully, his truck's traction control system engaging multiple times as his wheels fought for grip on the treacherous surface. Once safely past the hazard, he grabbed his CB radio with shaking hands. "Breaker 1N. This is Desert Runner eastbound at mile marker 70. Be advised, there's black ice on the westbound side just past the curve. Repeat, black ice on westbound I-80 at mile marker 69. The responses came immediately. Thanks for the heads up, Desert Runner. How did you spot it in this weather?" Asked a driver heading west. Marcus paused, unsure how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. "Just got lucky, I guess," he replied, though luck seemed an inadequate explanation for his supernatural passenger. Marcus completed his run to Reno without further incident, but he could not shake the memory of the elderly woman. The next morning, while his truck was being unloaded, he visited the Nevada Highway Patrol office and described his encounter. The desk sergeant, a weathered man named Patterson, who had worked the I-80 corridor for 15 years, listened with growing interest. "What did she look like exactly?" Patterson asked, pulling out a thick file folder. Marcus described the woman in detail, her cream-colored dress, her perfectly styled gray hair, her slight European accent, and her obsession with visiting her daughter in Reno. Patterson nodded slowly and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1987. The headline read, Elderly woman dies in I-80 accident near Hawk. The accompanying photograph showed the same woman Marcus had picked up down to the cream-colored dress and small suitcase. According to the article, Eleanor Hoffman, age 73, had been killed instantly when her 1983 Buick sedan hit black ice and rolled over near mile marker 48. She had been traveling to Reno to visit her daughter when the accident occurred. She appears every few years, Patterson explained. Always near mile marker 48, always warning drivers about hazardous conditions ahead. We have had at least a dozen reports over the years, all describing the same woman wearing the same dress. Some drivers think she is just a confused hitchhiker until she vanishes from their cab. Others never see her at all. Patterson showed Marcus photographs of the accident site from 1987. The twisted wreckage of Eleanor's Buick was scattered across the same stretch of highway where Marcus had found black ice the night before. The strange thing is, Patterson continued, she only appears when there really is danger ahead. All of the drivers who have reported seeing her have been spared some kind of disaster: ice, washouts, drunk drivers, and mechanical problems. It seems as though she is still trying to make that final visit to her daughter. Marcus felt a great sense of gratitude and anxiety as he left the highway police office. A ghost guarded by a deceased woman had saved him from trying to make the same weekly journey. He started to look more closely at Eleanor Hoffman's story over the next few months. He learned that Margaret, her daughter, had been waiting at the Reno bus station for 3 days following the tragedy, unaware that her mother had passed away. Eleanor never got to deliver the Christmas presents she had been packing in her suitcase. When Marcus told his story, the trucking industry, which is typically wary of claims involving the paranormal, started to pay attention. Similar incidents on the same section of road were reported by other drivers. A trend became apparent. Only when weather conditions produced the same black ice that had killed her did Eleanor appear to vehicles that were in grave danger. She never acknowledged her ghostly state or talked about her own death. Instead, she helped others avoid her fate as she continued her never-ending journey to Reno. Marcus ordered a small memorial stone with Eleanor's name and the straightforward words, "Guardian Angel of the Highway," placed close to mile marker 48. Drivers would leave coffee, flowers, and small tokens of respect at the memorial, which turned into an unofficial shrine. Drivers for the company started to report strange activities close to the location: CB radios crackling, a woman's voice warning, unidentified individuals flagging them down only to disappear, as well as an inexplicable urge to slow down and look around. After initially being dubious about the reports, the Nevada Department of Transportation eventually admitted the Eleanor Hoffman phenomenon in its safety briefings. They enhanced winter maintenance in the area and placed additional warning signs close to mile marker 48. The section of Interstate 80 where she passed away turned into one of its safest sections. The protective presence of a woman who refused to let her last journey end in tragedy, rather than through improved technology or increased enforcement. Even now, seasoned truck drivers still tell newcomers about Interstate 80's ghost hitchhiker, Eleanor Hoffman. When elderly travelers unexpectedly arrive in the Nevada desert, they are advised to pay close attention, especially if they are traveling to visit relatives. At truck stops along his route, Marcus tells other drivers, "She saved my life." The highway patrol file on Eleanor Hoffman is still open, not as an unresolved case, but as a memorial to the enduring connections between the living and the dead on America's most desolate roads. And she is still out there, still trying to get home, still making sure others make it safely too. Her narrative reminds us that some paths go beyond death itself, and that people other than the living use the roads that link our country. Jake Morrison should have arrived in Denver by dawn based on his fuel log. He bought a full tank of diesel at 11:30 p.m., according to the exact records that documented his 15-year career as an owner-operator. At Pueblo, he had 40 gallons left over after running 120 meters to reach his destination. With construction delays and his self-imposed speed limits taken into consideration, His GPS unit predicted that he would arrive at 4:45 a.m. However, Jake Morrison was still traveling the same stretch of US Highway 50 that he had entered 6 hours prior when the light crested the Rocky Mountains that October morning. His odometer showed an unfathomable 847 extra miles on what should have been a routine overnight haul, and his gasoline gauge was almost empty. Jake Morrison was not a man who made mistakes. At 41, he had established a reputation for accuracy and dependability, landing contracts with companies that demanded accurate documentation and on-time arrival. His 2019 Kenworth W900L was outfitted with every tracking device and monitoring system imaginable, including dash cams that captured his emotions while driving and electronic logging devices that recorded every movement he made. As a backup, he kept painstaking paper journals in which he recorded weather, road hazards, and fuel consumption with the meticulousness of a scientist conducting an experiment. Like hundreds of others, that night started. At precisely 11:47 p.m., Jake left the Flying J truck stop in Pueblo, his trailer loaded with machine parts, on his way to a manufacturing facility in Denver. In front of him was US Highway 50 West, a well-known asphalt ribbon that he had traversed over 300 times during his career. Through the Colorado State Fairgrounds, through Fowler and Manzanola, then northwest toward Colorado Springs, and finally onto Interstate 25 north into Denver, the route was ingrained in his muscle memory. With temperatures hovering around freezing and no precipitation predicted, the night was clear and icy. Other commercial vehicles making their overnight rounds made up the majority of the light traffic. Jake found his rhythm. His favorite country music station was playing in the background as he drove. The cruise control was set at precisely 67 miles per hour, and the CB radio was tuned to channel 19 for traffic alerts. Jake entered the time and place in his logbook as he passed through the tiny community of Rocky Ford at 12:23 a.m. With the exception of a few pickup trucks parked outside a 24-hour diner, the town's main street was deserted, as required by business regulation. Before starting their own late-night drives, their drivers surely grabbed coffee. The well-known landmarks didn't seem particularly noteworthy or special. Against the starry sky, the grain elevator rose. The railroad crossing typically calls for caution. The billboard for a nearby car dealership that had existed for as long as Jake had been traveling this route. At 12:43 a.m., 20 minutes later, once more, Jake went through Rocky Ford. It took him a moment to realize. When familiar routes become background noise in their minds, long-distance drivers experience a type of trance known as highway trance. At first, Jake blamed the frequent sighting on fatigue or distraction. Maybe he's passed another small town with similar characteristics in Colorado. However, when he looked at his GPS unit, the screen indicated that he was exactly where he had registered 20 minutes earlier, at mile marker 43 on US Highway 50, west in Rocky Ford, Colorado. At the next wide spot on the shoulder, Jake pulled over and took a close look at his gear. There were no error messages displayed on his GPS unit. With accuracy readings of plus or minus 3 feet, its satellite connection remained strong. Since his last sighting of Rocky Ford, his odometer had advanced exactly 20.7 miles, which was the exact distance he would anticipate traveling at his observed pace during that time. He attributed the strangeness to a GPS glitch, but oddly, impossible. He was in the same place he had been before, staring at the same diner, the same grain elevator, and the same billboard advertising trucks he would never need. Throughout his career, Jake's habit of consulting his paper road atlas had shielded him from numerous technological setbacks. The map showed that US Highway 50 West passed through Rocky Ford in a straight line, without any turns, loops, or detours that might have caused his apparent displacement. Using his finger, he traced the line, noting that the highway continued directly northwest toward his destination. Jake kept on driving, focusing more on mile markers and landmarks. At precisely 12:51 a.m., he entered the time in his logbook as he crossed the Rocky Ford city limit sign. As anticipated, the grain elevator disappeared from his mirrors and the recognizable array of rural landscapes swept past his windshield. A group of mailboxes at a dirt road intersection where residents used to get to their homes, a concrete bridge across an irrigation canal, and an abandoned farmhouse with a bright red barn. In his headlights, Jake noticed the abandoned farmhouse with the recognizable red barn approaching at 1:11 a.m. There was no mistaking what was taking place this time. During his last passage, Jake had committed every detail of that farmhouse to memory. The old water tower drooping at a dangerous angle behind the buildings, the way the barn door hung askew, and the main structure's pattern of broken windows. In a different location, these buildings were not comparable. Even though he had been driving continuously in a straight line during that time, he had seen these exact same structures 20 minutes earlier. Jake's hands had started to shake as he gripped his CB radio. Breaker 1N. Jake Morrison is seen here traveling west on Highway 50. Are there any drivers out there who could verify your location for me? Before a recognizable voice answered, the radio crackled with static. This is Desert Rose, traveling east on 50. About 10 minutes ago, I went through La Junta. Jake, where are you? The voice was that of Maria Santos, a driver Jake had known for years who frequently traveled between Colorado and Kansas. Even as he uttered those words, Jake realized how ridiculous they sounded. I think I am locked in some sort of loop at Rocky Ford. I repeatedly crossed the same landmarks. Have you ever heard of anything similar occurring? After more than a minute of silence, Maria's worried voice finally came back. How are you feeling, Jake? Perhaps you ought to stop and rest. Your mind may occasionally be disturbed by these nighttime adventures. However, Jake was aware that this was neither fatigue nor delusions. The systems on his truck were operating as they should. His mind was alert and keen, and it was easy to see the physical evidence of his condition. He started to document everything in too much detail. Voice recordings recording each oddity, pictures of his GPS display, and timestamps for each landmark. At least it would be evidence for investigators to examine if this was some kind of collapse. Jake went through Rocky Ford for the third time at 1:31 a.m. From the configuration of pickup trucks outside the diner to the burned-out streetlight by the railroad crossing, the village looked exactly like it had on his earlier visits. This time, though, Jake saw something that made him freeze. His own truck, a perfect replica of his Kenworth W90L, with his personal call sign and company logo painted on the door, appeared in the diner parking lot. Jake pulled into the lot and parked next to what looked to be his own car. Everything about the duplicate truck was the same. The bumper has the same scratches, the tires have the same mud pattern, and the passenger door has minor damage from a minor accident that happened 3 years ago. The cab was empty, but the trailer displayed the same load number and destination details as his own equipment. Behind the foggy windshield, no driver is visible. Breathless in the cold mountain air, Jake leaped from his truck and walked toward the replica car. With its shiny chrome surfaces reflecting his picture and casting shadows under the parking lot lights, the truck looked real and solid. The warmth of an engine that had recently been running filled his palm as he placed it on the hood. The level of the gasoline tank matched that of his own car. He also noticed his own logbook, which was open on the passenger seat and contained entries in his own handwriting detailing the same incomprehensible journey he was going through when he peered through the driver's side window. When Jake realized he was stuck in some kind of time or space anomaly, panic started to set in. It was inexplicable. His cell phone was showing full signal strength when he tried to call his dispatcher, but the call went straight to voicemail. His internet connection appeared to be working, but it was unable to load any websites or programs, and text messages were unsuccessful. Cut off from the normal flow of time and space, he was secluded in a bubble of unreality. Jake went back to his truck and continued to drive in the hopes that whatever force was holding him in this recurring nightmare would be broken by forward motion. He drove with mechanical accuracy, maintaining precise direction and speed while recording each iteration of the familiar sights. He returned to Rocky Ford with the mathematical accuracy of a clock mechanism, covering exactly 20.7 miles in 20 minutes on each round. During his fourth trip through town, Jake noticed that the external sign for the diner had a clock that was running backwards, with its hands turning counterclockwise at regular speed. Transmissions from decades before started to come in on the radio in his pickup. Country music from the 1970s, news articles about events that happened in the 1980s, and weather predictions for dates that have already passed. Within the confines of his perpetual loop, time itself appeared to be moving backwards, as though he had been ensnared in a temporal tornado that repeatedly reproduced the same moments. By the sixth time, Jake started seeing different versions of himself. He would see his truck coming up the other way, driven by someone who looked exactly like him but never acknowledged him. Occasionally, he would come across a convoy of Jake Morrison's cars, all of which were duplicates, caught in the same impossible journey, and all of them seemed unaware of one another. He felt an existential horror that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought when he saw his own face behind the wheel of another car, staring straight ahead with the expressionless blankness of someone trapped in a highway trance. In an effort to break the pattern, Jake stopped completely, turned around, took different routes through Rocky Ford, and even got out of his truck and walked down the highway. Nothing was successful. Every time he tried to leave the predetermined circle, he somehow ended up going back to his truck and finding himself back on US Highway 50, passing the same landmarks in the same sequence. Like a record player stuck in the same groove, the universe seemed intent on keeping him trapped in this 20 INUT stretch of highway. As the evening wore on, Jake started to realize that he was trapped in a recursive cycle of time itself, rather than just being confined in space. With only his heightened awareness noticing any change between repetitions, each repetition was not just a return to the same place, but also to the same time, reenacting the same series of events. He was repeatedly going through the same 20 minutes, learning and forming memories as the world around him returned to its initial state. After hours of driving, his truck's gasoline gauge remained strangely steady. He estimated that his diesel should have run out before his third circle. However, the tank level remained at the 3/4 full reading it had at the start of the anomaly. His truck was not being affected by time in the usual way, as though the entire cause and effect chain had been suspended inside his prison. At precisely 3:33 a.m., Jake made a last-ditch choice on his 17th iteration of the loop. Rather than keep driving in the hopes of breaking free, he stopped his truck completely in the middle of US Highway 50 and turned off the engine. For the first time since entering the anomaly, he sat in complete silence, listening to the whisper of wind through his slightly open window and the click of cooling metal. Everything around him seemed to hold its breath. Everything went quiet, including the background chatter of his CB radio, the hum of tires on asphalt, and the familiar sounds of his diesel engine. In the confined space of his taxi, Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and the feeble rhythm of his breathing. He decided to stay motionless until something changed or he understood the extent of his captivity, so he waited, counting seconds and then minutes. Something changed at precisely 3:33 a.m. Suddenly, like a weight being released from his chest, the oppressive feeling of recycling and repetition that had characterized his night vanished. Jake experienced the return of reality to its normal state. When he checked his GPS, he saw that he was exactly where he should have been if he had been driving correctly for the previous 4 hours at mile marker 423 on US Highway 50, 17 miles past Rocky Ford. With his hands still shivering from the experience, Jake turned on his engine and drove on toward Denver. His CB radio picked up the regular traffic from other drivers running their morning errands, and his fuel gauge now showed the estimated use for the distance he had traveled. Jake carried with him the memory of those unfathomable hours when time itself had been unstuck, even though the world had returned to its familiar patterns of cause and effect. Despite his subjective experience of being stranded for more than 4 hours, Jake's delivery was exactly on time when he arrived in Denver. Every clock, GPS unit, and logbook entry indicated that his trip from Pueblo had taken the usual amount of time, free of unforeseen delays or detours. His own recollection and the pictures he had taken of his GPS during the loops were the only proof of his suffering. Images that no longer displayed the strange coordinates he had reported, instead displayed normal readings. Jake never went into great detail about what had happened to him on US Highway 50, but he did report to his firm that he was having trouble navigating near Rocky Ford. For several more months, he kept taking the same route. But every time he got to Rocky Ford, he would grip the steering wheel a bit more firmly and pay closer attention to his clocks, recalling the night when time itself had trapped him in a never-ending loop of the same 20 minutes. On the same section of highway, other drivers started to report the same incidents: lost time, driving in circles even though you were on a straight path, and repeating landmarks. Eventually, the Colorado Department of Transportation admitted to receiving several reports of navigation anomalies near Rocky Ford, but they did not acknowledge that there might have been a real temporal anomaly on US Highway 50. Instead, they blamed the incidents on GPS interference from nearby military installations. Jake Morrison never went through another loop, but he never forgot the fear of being trapped in the cyclical clutches of time. Driving the same section of the eerie highway for eternity while reality reverberated all around him like a broken record that would not let him go to the next song. Breaker in. Can anyone see this caravan up ahead? At 3:17 a.m., Linda Washington's CB radio crackled those words. Midway between Gallup and Grants, New Mexico, close to Interstate 40. The voice was that of a driver she had never heard before, tinted with an accent that seemed to be from a different decade. Under a blanket of stars that seemed particularly bright that November night, Linda looked in her mirrors and searched the dark road ahead, but all she saw was empty asphalt that stretched toward the far mountains. The second generation of Washington family drivers was represented by 28-year-old Linda Washington. The highway felt more dangerous and enigmatic than it does now, with GPS tracking and satellite communication, thanks to her father's memories of driving these same southwestern routes in the 1970s and 1980s, when CB radios were the only means of communication between drivers. Linda maintained a respectful awareness of forces that other drivers dismissed as superstition or fantasy, because she was a Cherokee woman who had grown up hearing her grandmother's tales of spirits that traveled the historic routes. Every contemporary convenience and safety feature imaginable was installed in her 2017 Freightliner Cascadia. The car was the pinnacle of modern engineering, with features like electronic logging devices that monitored her every move for legal compliance and collision avoidance technology. Intended to lessen the risks and uncertainties that had turned the drivers of her father's generation into cautionary tales and folk heroes. But on this specific night, Linda would learn that some roads remember their past in ways that no amount of contemporary technology can erase, as she traveled through the center of Navajo Nation territory, along a route that paralleled historic trade routes that indigenous peoples had used for thousands of years. In her 3 years as an owner-operator, she had driven the freight route from Phoenix to Oklahoma City dozens of times, so it was just routine work. Consumer electronics, which needed close attention to schedules and security regulations, were transported in her trailer to distribution centers in the Midwest. Despite embracing the technological demands of contemporary trucking, Linda took pride in upholding the cultural customs her grandmother had taught her. She always respected the land she traveled through as the ancestral home of the tribes who had lived there for centuries, carried sage and sweet grass in her cab, and offered tobacco to the spirits at specific holy locations. When Linda reached the top of a long rise in the road at 3:23 a.m., she saw them, a row of taillights that stretched across the horizon like red stars falling toward Earth. In the distance, the convoy seemed to be made up of at least 20 cars traveling westward, their lights creating a lovely procession. What immediately caught Linda's attention was the uniformity of the trucks, light patterns, which suggested that they were from a bygone era when lighting configurations were different from what is now considered normal, and the distance between them, far closer than current safety regulations would permit. In response to the previous transmission, Linda grabbed her CB radio. Breaker 19. This is Cherokee Rose traveling west on I-40 close to mile marker 120. I can verify the image of the convoy you mentioned. They're still in your sights. Before the same voice spoke again, the radio crackled with static for a few seconds. It was clearer now, but still had an odd sound that echoed a little, like the broadcast bouncing off far-off mountains. That's right, Cherokee Rose. They may be running at 75 or 80 miles per hour. I've never seen anything like it. Radio calls are not being answered by them. Additionally, I can't see any company markings on their trailers. Linda heard what sounded like wind rushing through the transmission as the voice paused. Something else is involved. Cherokee got up. They only have taillights on while they run, no running lights. No clearance lights, no marker lights. As though they're trying to blend in. As Linda remained on the highway, slowly reducing the gap with the enigmatic convoy, she started to notice things that made it harder for her to understand what she was going through. The trucks in front of her seemed to be 1950s or early 1960s models, their distinct sizes and shapes clearly visible in her headlights, as she occasionally caught up to the group. She could see the distinctive chrome features and rounded corners that defined trucks from a bygone era of American trucking, and the trailers were thinner and shorter than contemporary equipment. Other voices, most likely from the convoy's communication network, started to come in on her CB radio. Linda had never heard such a conversation on modern CB frequencies. The drivers referred to sites using names that had not been used in decades, and they used 10 codes and terminology that were ahead of current standards. They discussed routes and schedules with the casual familiarity of truckers who had traveled these roads many times before, and they talked about gas stations and truck stops that Linda knew had been closed or destroyed years earlier. The Shadow Fleet's breaker, Desert Ghost running drag is this. Our company is on our side. Cherokee Rose in a white freighter. Shall we make room for her to pass? The transmission was so clear that, even in the chilly November air, Linda could hear the distinctive sound of an old diesel engine in the background, along with wind noise that suggested open windows. The reference to Shadow Fleet, a term that Linda had never heard in trucking circles but that had dreadful connotations, sent a shiver down her spine. Stories from her grandmother poured back, legends of spirit travelers who wandered between worlds, occasionally visible to the living and occasionally invisible, always following ancient routes that linked holy sites and influential locations. Parts of historic Route 66, which had itself traced trade routes and paths used by indigenous peoples for countless years, had been covered by Interstate 40. This is Cherokee Rose to Desert Ghost, Linda said in a firm voice that belied her growing fear. I'm just trying to keep to my schedule, not trying to pass. Tonight, you are all leading a special convoy. After a minute or so, the question lingered in the air before Desert Ghost spoke, his voice resonating with a sense of regret that seemed to come from decades of fatigue. Cherokee Rose is always in operation, been trying to complete what we began, running the same route since 1952. Even when every driver has left, some races continue. Linda was left with more questions than answers as the broadcast faded into static, and she began to realize that she was witnessing something that existed beyond the traditional boundaries of time and space. Linda turned on the dash camera on her truck and started recording what she saw, recording her observations for future research. Each truck was precisely the same distance from the trucks in front and behind, and the convoy maintained its formation with mathematical precision. Their pace was so well coordinated that it suggested either superhuman coordination or an almost impossible level of driving skill. She watched as the lead truck started to move in a coordinated manner over hills and curves, as though they were all responding to the same unseen conductor. Later that night, while on a rest break, she would research the history of trucking in New Mexico and learn about the dark past that inspired the Shadow Fleet's name and mission. A group of independent truckers had tried to break the speed limit when they crossed New Mexico in 1952. In an attempt to promote a new freight company, they raced from the Arizona border to the Texas line. The 21 trucks in the convoy were all operated by seasoned drivers who thought their skills and readiness would enable them to safely maintain dangerous speeds over the desert roads. Near the spot where Linda met the phantom convoy, the race had ended tragically. 13 drivers lost their lives in a multi-vehicle accident that destroyed the majority of the participating trucks due to a combination of mechanical problems, driver fatigue, and poor road conditions. The freight company had shut down within months of the disaster, and the survivors had never discussed what had happened that night in public. The negative press that followed the deaths damaged its reputation. However, it was clear that the ghosts of those lost drivers had never given up racing. Travelers have long reported ghost lights, phantom cars, and the sounds of motors and CB radio conversations coming from empty highways. Linda confirmed this with local tribe elders. Similar stories from the earliest days of automobile travel were documented by the Navajo Nation, demonstrating that certain sections of the road preserved the emotions and memories of people who had perished in violent accidents while passing through their territory. As Linda kept an eye on the convoy, she started to notice that the cars seemed to be aging backwards, their condition gradually getting better, as though time were moving backwards for them. The tarnished chrome glistened. What had appeared to be faded paint began to shimmer, and the old, harsh-sounding mechanical noises grew smoother and more powerful. The convoy appeared to be marching not just through space, but also through time, returning to the time when they were brand new trucks with active drivers pursuing fame and success. As the evening wore on, the CB conversation grew more heated as the phantom drivers discussed specifics of their planned route, fuel calculations, and tactical considerations regarding when to accelerate and when to be cautious. As the vehicles strained to finish their interrupted journey, Linda found herself listening to conversations that had first occurred more than 70 years ago, replayed endlessly. Unaware that their race would end tragically, the shouts exuded the confidence and joy of men who thought they were making history. Its desert ghost once more, Cherokee rose. "We will soon be near the crossing point. This is the time to respect the traditional methods if you want to do so." The coordinates that Linda recognized as a sacred spot her grandmother had told her about, a location where many ancient pathways converged and where gifts should be given to ensure a safe journey, were included with the communication. At the next wide spot, Linda stopped and took out the tobacco and sage she always had on hand for such situations. She made an offering to the spirits of the lost drivers, honoring their sacrifice and requesting their protection for everyone who traveled the Southwest's perilous roads, as she had been instructed to do by her grandmother. The convoy slowly dwindled out of sight as she finished the ceremony, their taillights growing weaker and farther away until they blended with the stars and vanished completely. With the exception of the occasional message from actual drivers making their own late-night trips across the desert, the CB radio went silent. Linda went back to her pickup feeling as though she had seen something sacred and terrible. An insight into how human ambition and desire endure beyond the limits of life and death. As a warning and a source of comfort for future drivers who traverse the eerie roads of the American Southwest, the Shadow Fleet would carry on with its never-ending race, forever, in an attempt to finish the journey that had cost them their lives. Linda carried the memory of the Shadow Fleet with her as she ran to Oklahoma City. But she had no strange encounters. She started looking into similar incidents reported by other Native American drivers as she resumed her regular freight routes throughout the area. She found a network of accounts and experiences that implied the Southwest's highways were inhabited by much more than just live travelers. The roads recalled their deceased. And occasionally, when the circumstances were right, the past would scream back to provide direction, cautions, and reminders of the dangers that had always lingered on the edges of America's transportation systems. By sharing her encounter with the Shadow Fleet and learning from other drivers who had gone through similar experiences, the Cherokee Rose established herself as a frequent contributor to a CB channel devoted to unearthly encounters on southwestern highways. They formed an unofficial network of watchers and guardians together, people who understood that maintaining their equipment and adhering to safety regulations were equally important as honoring the spirit of the road. Even now, truckers traversing New Mexico on Interstate 40 report encounters with old-fashioned truck convoys that come and go without warning. Voices from a different era crackled on their CB radios, talking about origins, plans, and aspirations that met a tragic end decades ago. The Shadow Fleet keeps racing toward a goal they will never achieve. Despite being permanently stuck on their last journey, they continue to offer guidance and protection to the remaining drivers who share their endless highway. Tommy Chen's odometer was in perfect condition. Every system in his 2020 Peterbilt 389 operated in accordance with manufacturer specifications, according to the comprehensive inspection report generated by Roadmaster Truck Services in Santa Fe on November 8, 2023. 3 weeks prior, as part of his routine DOT inspection, the digital odometer had been calibrated. Across standardized test distances, its accuracy was confirmed to be within 1/10 of a mile. However, based on Tommy's meticulously maintained maintenance logs, his truck had inexplicably gained 347 miles on what should have been a normal 89-mile journey along U.S. Highway 285 south from Santa Fe to Roswell, New Mexico. Tommy Chen graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in mechanical engineering before the 2008 financial crisis forced him to rethink his career path. After 15 years, he had built a successful owner-operated business based on his analytical approach to the industry. At first, trucking had been a stopgap solution, a way to pay bills while looking for an engineering job. Tommy used data and a scientific approach to optimize every aspect of his operations, while other drivers relied on experience and intuition. He had developed his own algorithms for route planning and fuel efficiency calculations. This methodical approach was evident in his truck. The cab was equipped with a full suite of monitoring equipment that tracked everything from engine temperature to tire pressure, electronic recording devices that recorded his position every minute, and multiple GPS units for redundancy. Tommy would have impressed his former engineering colleagues with his meticulous spreadsheets that detailed fuel consumption, maintenance schedules, and performance metrics. He saw trucking as a science, and he thought that even the most unpredictable profession could be made safe and risk-free with sufficient data and careful analysis. Tommy's routine pre-trip inspection checklist, a 47-point examination that he faithfully completed prior to every departure, kicked off that November evening. Precision lab equipment for the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Socorro was housed in his trailer, cargo that needs vibration monitoring and climate control during transit. The journey along U.S. Highway 285 was straightforward. It was a well-maintained route that went straight south through the high desert region of northern New Mexico, passing through the villages of Lamy, Galasto, and Vaughn before arriving at its destination. Tommy recorded his odometer reading of precisely 847, 329.7 miles, along with the weather, tire pressure, and fuel levels in his logbook as he left the Santa Fe terminal at 10:47 p.m. With temperatures dropping toward freezing and no precipitation predicted, the night was bright and chilly. In order to get to the observatory facilities, his GPS unit showed the standard route south on U.S. Highway 285, which should take 2 hours and 12 minutes. At 11:23 p.m., the first indication that something was amiss appeared. Tommy was traveling south when he arrived at mile marker 347. After traveling about 36 miles from Santa Fe, he should have seen mile marker 341 at that point in his journey, based on his prior experience and GPS calculations. Tommy assumed one of his GPS units had lost satellite signal or malfunctioned, so he pulled over to check them. Similar readings from all three devices put him close to the correct coordinates for U.S. Highway 285, South's mile marker 347. However, his known starting position and elapsed trip time did not add up in the calculations. Throughout his career, Tommy had relied on his thorough road atlas, a habit that had helped him navigate construction detours and GPS failures. With the numbering system beginning at the Colorado border and counting down toward the Texas line, the atlas suggested that as he continued south from Santa Fe, the mile markers on U.S. Highway 285 should actually get fewer. However, the actual mile marker he had just passed accurately read 347 in the format and type used by the Department of Transportation, closely resembling the look of real highway markers he had seen during his career. Tommy went south, paying more attention to the numbered sequence, thinking that he had somehow misread the signpost in the darkness. He passed mile marker 348 at 11:31 p.m. He came upon mile marker 349 8 minutes later. According to his compass and GPS devices, he was driving north, but the mile signs were counting upward rather than downward, indicating that he was heading steadily south. At the next wide spot on the shoulder, Tommy pulled over and checked all of his navigation equipment. A digital compass app on his smartphone that made use of the device's built-in magnetometer verified that his magnetic compass was always pointing south. Consistent coordinates from his 3 GPS units showed him traveling south on US Highway 285 and slowly approaching his destination in Socorro. He was unquestionably traveling south across the New Mexico countryside, as evidenced by the stars that were visible through his windshield remaining in their predicted locations in relation to his direction of travel. The mile markers, however, kept counting the opposite way. Tommy grabbed his CB radio so he could call other drivers who might be traveling the same path. Breaker 1N. This is Pacific Engineer traveling south on Highway 285 close to mile marker 350. Does anyone know if this highway's mile marker sequence is correct? The data I'm seeing doesn't match what I expected. Before a voice answered, the radio crackled with static, though the sound was strangely distorted, as if the signal were coming from a great distance or through air interference. Desert Scholar here, Pacific Engineer. In my 37 years of driving Highway 285, I have never witnessed mile markers act in such a manner as they do now. Even though I'm going in the same direction as always, they're counting backwards from where I started. There was a sense of confusion in the voice that Tommy found comforting but also unsettling. At least he wasn't the only motorist having trouble finding their way around. The mile marker sequence grew more surreal as Tommy continued south. Markers 351 and 352 were passed by him. Each one demonstrated that distance was being measured in a way that deviated from its usual pattern. The gradual change in his environment was more disturbing. Beyond his windows, the scenery gradually changed, giving the impression that he was traveling through time as well as space. Older concrete and asphalt give way to newer road construction. Lettering and designs from previous decades were displayed on highway signs. Even the few buildings he could make out in the distance seemed to be relics of the past, their architecture growing more modern as he went. Tommy turned on his truck's dash cam and started filming the strangeness, recording his thoughts for later analysis. It is 11:47 p.m. Mile markers show position 354 and still growing, but the odometer reads 847, 365.44 miles, or about 36 miles from the starting point. Although physical evidence suggests mobility in both temporal and spatial dimensions, GPS coordinates are still consistent with southward transit on the right roadway. Broadcasts that appeared to be from various eras started to come up on his radio. Weather forecasts for dates that had already passed, traffic reports about highway conditions from decades ago, and news articles about events Tommy remembered from his childhood blended with music from the 1960s and 1970s. The voices had the casual immediacy of live broadcasts rather than preserved recordings, and they sounded genuine rather than nostalgic recreations. Tommy had an experience at mile marker 359 that fundamentally altered his scientific perspective. There was another car coming from the other way, north toward Santa Fe. As the car slid under his headlights, Tommy realized it was exactly the same size and look as his own Peterbilt 389, right down to the unique paint job and business logo he had selected for his company's name. A young man who resembled Tommy himself sat behind the wheel, dressed in clothes from a few years ago, and had the assured expression of someone who had not yet experienced the impossible. Tommy saw the other driver's logbook open on the passenger seat, but the contact lasted only a few seconds. The pages appeared to have entries in his own handwriting that described trips and locations from early in his career, when he was still establishing his company and becoming familiar with the intricacies of long-haul trucking. He seemed to have passed a younger version of himself who had been on the same road at a previous stage of his life. Tommy reached for his CB radio right away. "This is Pacific Engineer, Desert Scholar. Did you notice the Peterbilt heading north that was right by me? It was driven by a person who looked exactly like me, and it resembled my pickup." It was a quick response, full of both excitement and fear. Pacific Engineer, I've been seeing multiple incarnations of my own truck tonight, each traveling in a different direction at various locations along this road. Like pictures from my past strewn across the street, each one represents a distinct phase of my work. I suppose that in addition to distance, we are also traveling through time. As the evening wore on, Tommy started to realize that US Highway 285 had somehow been freed from the shackles of time. With every mile he traveled, the backward-counting mile markers led him farther into his own past by showing not just reverse distance measurement, but also reverse time flow. Within their constrained framework, his truck systems kept operating as usual. However, the road itself existed in a state of temporal flux that permitted the past, present, and future to coexist in the same physical space. Throughout the night, Tommy encountered numerous incarnations of himself, each representing a different stage of his trucking career. In his mind, he was a terrified novice who was learning how to handle mountain grades. A self-assured mid-career driver, he maximizes routes, builds relationships with customers, and navigates numerous obstacles in his career. Every conversation offered insights into his choices, challenges, and the gradual development of his perspective on the trucking sector. With drivers from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and beyond, all speaking simultaneously across the time spans that typically divided their experiences, the radio conversation turned into a cacophony of voices from various eras. Tommy heard arguments about outdated technology, debates about legislation that had long since been updated or repealed, and discussions about fuel prices from decades ago. It seemed as though every conversation, every journey, and every moment that had ever taken place along US Highway 285 had been preserved in its entirety. Tommy made a crucial choice at mile marker 381. Rather than travel further back in time, he stopped his truck completely and started measuring his situation scientifically. With the help of his engineering background, he was able to scientifically record the temporal anomaly by gathering information on the air conditions, equipment readings, timestamps, and coordinates that would help explain how a section of highway might defy basic physics. Time was not moving through the affected area at a steady pace, according to Tommy's measurements. Depending on where he was on the freeway, his digital clocks ran at different speeds. Temporal progression can be slower or faster than usual. The odometer's backward counting, which measured miles traveled into the past rather than toward a geographic goal, was an accurate representation of movement via reverse time rather than a glitch. Tommy made the most important discovery when he realized that the temporal distortion was concentrated on a specific coordinate approximately 15 miles south of Santa Fe, close to the location of a serious traffic accident that had happened in 1987. According to media reports, he later learned that a collision involving several trucks and other vehicles had killed many people and caused major changes to safety procedures and highway construction. A number of factors, such as driver fatigue, poor lighting, and ambiguous mile marker placement, which had been fixed by later road upgrades, had been attributed to the collision. Tommy believed that the temporal anomaly was a sort of temporal scar, a place where terrible events had disrupted time's normal course and created a recursive loop that trapped visitors in cycles of their past experiences. The time distortion and backward mile markers were not coincidental. Rather, they were based on the anniversary of the original catastrophe, which allowed history and the present to collide fatally. Reality twisted around Tommy at precisely 3:17 a.m., the same time as the 1987 accident. Immediately, the temporal distortion vanished, and time flow returned to normal. To show the correct mileage for his current location, his odometer leaped forward. The mile sign started counting in the right direction after his GPS unit connected with his actual location. Everyday traffic for modern cars making their own late-night trips across New Mexico took the place of the radio chatter of earlier decades. Tommy never forgot his journey through time on US Highway 285, even after completing his delivery to the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. Despite the accuracy of his measurements and the consistency of his data, he submitted comprehensive reports to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the New Mexico Department of Transportation, but his scientific documentation was dismissed as the result of driver fatigue and equipment failure. On the same section of road, other drivers started to report similar incidents, especially around the time of the first collision in 1987. The reports exhibited common patterns: mile markers that were counted backwards, radio broadcasts from earlier decades, conversations with younger versions of themselves, and temporal distortion that went against the grain of traditional highway travel. After receiving numerous reports of navigation anomalies close to mile marker 347, the New Mexico Department of Transportation finally acknowledged the problem, though they blamed the occurrences on optical illusions and GPS interference. Instead of acknowledging the concept of temporal distortion, Tommy Chen continued to operate his trucking company, but he never again crossed U.S. Highway 285 during the anniversary period of the incident that created its temporal oddity. Through trucking forums on CB radio networks, he told other truckers about his experience and cautioned them about the dangers of becoming stuck in the recursive time loop of the freeways. Because of his engineering background, he was able to formulate theories regarding how catastrophic events could cause long-lasting distortions in the fabric of space-time, especially in areas where a large number of transit routes intersected and concentrated the flow of human emotion and activity. Experienced drivers came to refer to the section of U.S. Highway 285 close to mile marker 347 as the backwards mile, where time itself could go backwards and ensnare unsuspecting tourists in a cyclical pattern of their own past experiences. In addition to learning to pay attention to mile marker sequences, drivers were also prepared for the possibility that certain roads might recall their past in ways that went against accepted physics and challenged basic beliefs about time and space. Tommy Chen still approaches trucking with scientific methods today, but he has broadened his knowledge to encompass phenomena that go beyond the realm of traditional engineering. In order to create a thorough theory that could explain how America's highways function not only as transportation routes but also as stores of memory, emotion, and experience that occasionally overflow into the normal course of time, he keeps meticulous records of temporal anomalies that are reported throughout the trucking industry. He learned from his experience traveling the backwards mile that there are more mysteries on the road than can ever be fully explained by data analysis. On a route he had traveled 200 times, David Park was reported to be late. Mountain West Freight's dispatcher had anticipated receiving his check-in call by 6:30 a.m., but the silence that followed his routine run from Denver to Salt Lake City continued into the morning hours without any explanation. With a number of tracking systems, satellite communication devices, and emergency beacons installed, David's 2021 Freightliner Cascadia should have prevented lengthy communication outages. However, every electronic monitoring system his employer used indicated that David Park and his car had simply disappeared in the early hours of December 15, 2023, somewhere along Interstate 70 in eastern Utah. David Park, who was 38 years old, was the epitome of the contemporary professional truck driver. During his 12 years of long-haul trucking, he had an impeccable safety record. His career was devoid of any avoidable accidents, moving violations, or late deliveries. Every night, at precisely 8 p.m., he called his wife, Sarah, because he was a family man. Irrespective of his location, a custom that had remained constant throughout his career until the evening of his disappearance. He was meticulous and cautious in his route planning, always factoring in extra time to account for potential cross-country travel delays due to weather, traffic, or technical difficulties. David's primary freight corridor was the 525-meter run from Denver to Salt Lake City, which he had mastered via practice and careful attention to every mile of highway, every truck stop, and every possible danger. He knew Interstate 70 through Utah as well as the streets of his own neighborhood. From the breathtaking climb over the Rocky Mountains to the lengthy descent into the high desert landscape around Grand Junction, Colorado, and finally the straight run across the red rock landscape of Utah in the direction of the Wasatch Mountains. It had started like hundreds of other December nights. At approximately 11:15 p.m., David left the Denver terminal, with his trailer full of consumer electronics, headed for Salt Lake City distribution centers. Throughout the stretch, the weather was excellent, with clear skies and temperatures well above freezing. There were no mechanical issues found during his pre-trip inspection. He had plenty of driving time to complete the excursion because his gas tanks were full, and his electronic logging device indicated that he was well within the hours of service limits. It wasn't until 2:47 a.m. that David realized something was amiss as he got closer to Green River, Utah, a tiny village. Unexpected information started to flash on the green highway signs that should have indicated the next exit. The signs said Goblin Valley State Park, 37 miles, and Capitol Reef National Park, 89 miles, rather than the next 3 exits for Green River, which he had seen hundreds of times before. South of his course were destinations on completely different roads. David drove west on what his GPS indicated was Interstate 70, initially blaming the discrepancy on either his own weariness or recent sign upgrades. He expected to see the well-known Green River truck stop, but the exits that showed up did not match his memories or his road atlas. Despite his extensive knowledge of Utah's highway system, he came across an exit for Moonstone Beach Recreation Area, a location he had never heard of. In order to get in touch with other vehicles that might be on the same route, David turned on his CB radio. "This is Mountain Runner traveling west on I-7 close to Green River, Breaker 119. Is there someone who can verify the current exit details? Signage for locations that don't match my atlas is what I'm seeing." The radio was quiet except for static, which was unusual for a major interstate highway that typically saw steady traffic at night. Despite having a full signal strength, his cell phone was unable to make calls to his wife or dispatcher. His truck's satellite communication system indicated no signal, and multiple attempts to send text messages were unsuccessful. David was growing more and more cut off from the outside world, even though the clear sky should have provided ideal reception conditions. Disconnected from the networks of communication that provided modern truckers with their safety supplies and support systems, the highway started to change subtly as David traveled west, which made it harder for him to see the path he was so familiar with. The well-known landmarks vanished to be replaced by unidentified rock formations and features of the terrain. With its delicate curves that gradually changed his direction without his conscious knowledge, the highway itself appeared to be guiding him away from his chosen course. The road itself appeared to resist his attempts to keep a straight westerly path, creating optical illusions that caused straight sections to appear curved and forcing him to follow the pavement's lead. Information on David's GPS units started to fluctuate. One showed him traveling southwest toward Zion National Park, and another showed him traveling northwest toward a location known as Fossil Butte National Monument. All 3 devices had been operating flawlessly when he left Denver, and their satellite reception indicators showed strong signals from multiple satellites, but the 3rd GPS unit displayed no position data at all, with only the message, "Location services unavailable." Please consult local maps displayed on its screen. Another source of confusion and growing anxiety was David's truck's gasoline indicator. The gauge indicated that his reserves were dropping at an unfathomable rate, even though he had just filled up in Grand Junction and had been driving for less than 2 hours since his last fuel stop. He estimated that he should have had at least 150 gallons left, which would have provided him with enough fuel for an additional 600 miles of travel. But only 47 gallons were shown in his tanks on the digital display, suggesting consumption rates that would have signaled serious engine problems or gasoline leaks that his monitoring systems ought to have detected. To check the gasoline differential, David stopped at the next exit. However, the exit ramp led to a short dirt road that disappeared into darkness outside of his headlights, rather than a truck stop or service area. Beyond the pavement was a dirt track that appeared to have been neglected for decades, but the exit sign had read services, fuel, food, and hotel in standard interstate formatting. David got back on the road, growing more concerned about his health, but unable to come up with any logical explanations for the strangeness he was feeling. As the night wore on, David realized that Interstate 70 was actively pursuing him, changing exit ramps and road signs to entice him off his original path and toward more remote and dangerous locations. The highway appeared to have a malicious intelligence that could change its own layout in real time, producing fictitious exits that led nowhere and phantom destinations that were there only to confuse and trap unsuspecting drivers. There was no apparent reason why David's truck started to have mechanical issues. It became harder and harder for him to steer, as though unseen hands were fighting for control of the wheel. At random, the brakes would apply, forcing him to slow down where the highway seemed to want him to stop and check suspect exits or roadside features. As though the truck were being controlled by forces outside his control and disregarding his input commands, his cruise control kicked in and started to accelerate faster than he had set. The worst part was when David's truck started to drive itself entirely. At 4:23 a.m., as he struggled to keep his hands on the steering wheel, an unseen force abruptly drew them away from the controls. The car then started to accelerate and started to take an unchosen exit. David could see scores of cars, trucks, and RVs scattered around the canyon as he followed a road that led toward what seemed to be a vast canyon system, full of abandoned cars. His headlights glinted on their rusting hulks, which resembled a car cemetery. While some of the cars seemed brand new, others appeared to have been there for decades, gradually being eroded by the desert environment. He realized that he was looking at the final fate of other drivers who had been lured off Interstate 70 by the predatory intelligence of the roads, trapped in the canyon system, and abandoned to die of exposure and thirst while their cars became part of the growing number of car bones. David made a desperate choice as he struggled against the unseen force that was steering his truck in the same direction. He reached for his engine controls and turned off the diesel completely, using momentum alone to slowly bring the 18-ton truck and trailer to a stop. As the truck settled on the shoulder of the exit ramp, David felt the steering wheel return to his control because the supernatural force that had been controlling his vehicle appeared incapable of functioning without engine power. Instead of letting himself be pushed into the car cemetery below, David got out of his cab and started to walk back toward the main highway. It was more than an hour's walk back to Interstate 70, during which he saw more abandoned cars by the side of the road. In a number of cases, their drivers are still visible, demonstrating that the highway's predatory behavior has been robbing people for decades. David was shocked to see normal traffic moving in both directions and other truckers communicating frequently on CB Channel 19 as he got closer to the main highway. The familiar sights he was so familiar with had returned to their proper locations, and the road signs bore accurate information for Interstate 70 West. His wife and dispatcher had been desperately looking for him when he missed his scheduled check-in, and his cell phone suddenly started functioning regularly, displaying scores of missed calls. At 6:45 a.m., a Utah Highway Patrol trooper spotted David strolling along the freeway close to Green River and saved his life. Sergeant Martinez, the officer, had participated in local search operations for missing passengers and was aware of reports of cars and drivers going missing along particular sections of the Lonely Route. Despite his earlier tests indicating nearly empty reserves, David's truck was miraculously recovered from the canyon system later that morning, with its gasoline tanks full. Numerous similar incidents over the preceding 10 years were found during the investigation into David's disappearance. Numerous incidents of drivers reporting mechanical problems that forced them to take unexpected detours, GPS malfunctions that led them to far-off places, and encounters with road signs that provided inaccurate information about services and destinations were all documented by the Utah Highway Patrol. The discovery of the car cemetery from which David had barely escaped, which contained the remains of visitors from the 1960s, was the most disturbing. Geological analyses of the region revealed rare magnetic anomalies and mineral deposits that could potentially disrupt electronic devices, offering a partial scientific explanation for the GPS and communication malfunctions experienced by impacted vehicles. However, conventional research techniques were unable to account for the supernatural aspects of David's experience, such as the invisible force that had operated his truck and the highway's seeming capacity to change its own configuration. After a short hiatus, David Park resumed trucking, but he never again drove through eastern Utah on Interstate 70 at night. He became an advocate for better safety measures in isolated areas during the peak of the highway's predatory behavior, supporting the installation of more emergency communication systems and routine patrol coverage for areas of the road where drivers were known to vanish. After recognizing the disappearance pattern, The Utah Department of Transportation added emergency call boxes, improved lighting, and routine monitoring of electronic traffic systems for unusual readings to the affected section of Interstate 70. At truck stops and rest areas, there were warning signs advising drivers to stay in the main travel lanes and to notify authorities right away if they saw any odd exit arrangements or road signs. Similar experiences with predatory freeways in the western United States were reported by other truckers. Roads that appeared to actively seek out tourists and lure them away from secure routes in the direction of rural areas where rescue was unlikely. The trucking community established unofficial networks to exchange information about hazardous highway segments, creating CB channels specifically for reporting paranormal activity and odd technical issues that would suggest the presence of hazardous road conditions. David was reminded by his experience on the hungry highway of Interstate 70 that there were more than just connections between cities in America's transportation system. Some roads had developed their own malevolent intelligence, consuming the cars and drivers who traveled through their desolate areas at night when there was little to no traffic and no chance of rescue. By using the familiarity and trust that drivers developed with their routes as weapons, these highways had evolved into predators in their own right, luring drivers away from safety and toward places from which few ever returned. These days, seasoned truck drivers are aware to be wary of road signs that don't match their expectations, exits that lead to unexpected locations, and mechanical issues that only arise on certain long highway segments. They are aware that some roads are more demanding than others, and that maintaining a long-haul trucking career requires not only mechanical knowledge and safe driving practices, but also the ability to recognize when the highway has turned against you. According to the allegations, the accident involved two trucks that were similar. During her 23 years with Pacific Coast Insurance, the insurance investigator Janet Morrison had dealt with thousands of commercial vehicle claims, but she had never encountered a report quite like the one that arrived on her desk early on March 18, 2024. The California Highway Patrol Incident Report states that at 3:42 a.m., a collision occurred on southbound Interstate 15 close to Victorville, containing what appeared to be two identical Peterbilt 579 cars with similar paint jobs, identical company emblems, and identical driver registration numbers. The fact that their system only had one driver and one vehicle presented a challenge. In the cutthroat freight market of Southern California, Rosa Martinez had established herself as one of the most dependable owner-operators. She was 33 years old and had a spotless driving record from 8 years of long-haul trucking, with no incidents, fines, or late deliveries to mark her career. At truck stops across the Southwest, her unique custom-painted Peterbilt 579 with a deep burgundy base and gold pinstriping, along with her personal trademark Desert Rose Freight, were easily identifiable. Rosa was proud of the way her truck looked and worked, spending thousands of dollars on custom accessories that set her rig apart from the thousands of other commercial vehicles that plied California's roads. Rosa's specialty was driving from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, where she delivered consumer goods, car parts, and electronics between distribution locations 3 times a week. She knew the Mojave Desert's Interstate 15 as well as the streets of her own neighborhood. She was familiar with every truck stop, way station, and mile marker along the 270-mile corridor that connected Southern California to the world's gambling capital, from the steep climb through the Cajon Pass to the long descent into Barstow and the straight run across the desert toward the Nevada border. The start of that March night had been ordinary enough. Around 11:30 p.m., Rosa left the Los Angeles terminal. Is transporting restaurant equipment to new casinos in Las Vegas in her trailer. Clear skies and moderate temperatures made for excellent driving conditions across the desert. There were no mechanical issues discovered during her pre-trip inspection. Her fuel tanks were filled up for the trip ahead, and her electronic recording equipment indicated that she was well within hours of service standards. At 1:47 a.m., Rose noticed her first warning sign that something was amiss as she made her way up the long incline to the Cajon Pass. she noticed a car following her in the passenger side mirror, about a quarter of a mile away. The car's headlight pattern and dimensions suggested that it was a Peterbilt, just like hers. The truck matched her speed precisely, demonstrating an experienced driver who understood how to handle traffic in the mountain grades, and it maintained a constant distance behind her, neither gaining nor losing ground. Rosa ignored the next truck at first. Since Interstate 15 was a major commercial route, it was common to see other motorists traveling at comparable speeds on well-traveled routes. However, as she started to descend toward Victorville after crossing the pass, she started to notice aspects of the following car that unnerved her. With the same burgundy paint job and gold pin striping that made her rig identifiable, the truck looked to be an exact replica of her own Peterbilt 579. Rosa grabbed her CB radio so she could call the next driver. Desert Rose is seen on the 5 close to K. John Pass in Breaker 19. Behind me is a burgundy Pete. Are you using the same equipment? The only sound coming from the radio was static, unusual for a major freight corridor that typically carried regular nighttime CB conversation. Rosa tried other channels, but the trailing truck didn't respond to any of them. The replica truck started to get closer as Rosa drove down the mountain grade, eventually settling in about 50 yards behind her trailer. Rosa could see that the truck was an exact replica of her own, down to the smallest detail, at this closer range. The cab was adorned with the same custom chrome accessories. Behind the back wheels were similar mudflap designs. Additionally, the duplicate car had the same small scratch on the passenger door that Rosa had picked up in a small parking lot mishap 2 years earlier. When Rosa saw the other driver in her mirrors, her uneasiness turned into genuine fear. A woman who resembled Rosa exactly sat behind the wheel of the same truck, wearing the eye-catching turquoise necklace that Rosa's grandmother had given her, along with the same shirt from the corporate uniform. Rosa's driving position and posture were identical to those of the doppelganger driver. Her hands were on the steering wheel in the same way, and her head was cocked in the same way Rosa unconsciously adopted when driving long distances. Rose was actively operating her own car when she saw her own face behind the wheel of a similar truck, which fundamentally altered her perception of reality. Thinking that fatigue might be causing hallucinations, she wiped her eyes. But when she looked again, she could see the driver and the replica truck in her mirrors. With trembling hands, Rosa reached for her CB radio and tried a variety of channels and emergency frequencies to contact anyone who might be going through the same unimaginable circumstance. Mayday, Mayday. Desert Rose is located close to Victorville on Interstate 15 heading south. Something that looks like a perfect replica of both my truck and me is pursuing me. Can someone verify that there are 2 identical burgundy Peterbilts in this neighborhood? Even though the weather was clear and should have allowed for good reception, Rosa's message went unanswered, and the radio produced only static. Rosa started to run into other truckers, who appeared to know both of her truck models, as she got closer to the truck stops and service stations around Victorville. Drivers were asking about the odd convoy arrangement and talking about the 2 Desert Rose vehicles on the CB radio. Rosa's truck passed them twice in a matter of minutes, once going south and once heading north, according to some drivers. Even though Rosa had continued to move south all night, the replica car started acting as though it was deliberately mimicking all of Rosa's movements rather than just following her. Rosa changed lanes to get ahead of slower traffic, and the doppelganger truck changed lanes at the exact same moment. The duplicate car made corresponding speed adjustments with timing that suggested supernatural coordination rather than human reaction times when Rosa changed her speed to maintain safe following distances. The signals from the mirror trucks flashed precisely in time with Rosa's turn signals, which she used to negotiate highway interchanges. In an attempt to disrupt the routine and initiate a meeting with her eerie counterpart, Rosa pulled into the Flying J truck stop in Victorville. The replica car parked in the nearby lot as she parked her truck, exactly matching Rosa's own truck in terms of positioning. Rosa got out of her taxi and walked over to the other car, her heart thumping as she got ready to face what seemed to be a perfect replica of herself. Behind the wheel of the duplicate truck, the doppelganger Rosa sat motionless, gazing straight ahead with the expressionless face of someone caught in a highway daze. The mirror driver perfectly replicated her clothes, jewelry, and even the small scar from a childhood accident on her left hand. In an attempt to get the other driver's attention, Rosa knocked on the window of the duplicate car, but got no response. Even though the car was parked and the engine was off, the lookalike continued to gaze forward, with her hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. In the parking lot, other truckers started to gather around the two identical vehicles, pointing and snapping pictures with their smartphones. Every vehicle and truck stop employee in the area took notice of the spectacle created by the sight of two identical trucks driven by identical drivers. Some drivers reported that they had been listening to CB conversations from both cars at the same time, with the same voice broadcasting simultaneously from different locations along the highway. In an attempt to find witnesses who could validate her experiences and possibly explain the miraculous duplication, Rosa went into the truck stop restaurant. Despite multiple eyewitness reports of two identical women in the parking lot, the on-duty manager claimed that the restaurant's security cameras only captured one Rosa Martinez entering the establishment. Rosa's precarious situation was made even more uncertain by the discrepancy between electronic proof and human observation. The replica truck had completely disappeared by the time Rosa returned to the parking lot 20 minutes later. Nobody had seen it go, and there were no indications that a car had ever parked there. The other truckers who had been taking pictures of the same cars discovered that their phones and cameras only displayed pictures of Rosa's real truck, leaving no trace of the doppelganger car they had clearly seen and recorded. Rosa kept running to Las Vegas without any strange encounters, but she was plagued by the memory of her mirror driver the entire way. She filed a thorough report with the California Highway Patrol and her insurance provider. Police, however, viewed her statement with suspicion because they were unable to find any tangible evidence of the duplicate truck or driver that numerous witnesses claimed to have seen. The insurance investigators' report became a legend within the industry because it was the kind of implausible claim that questioned the boundaries between reality and fiction, not because it detailed a real-life supernatural incident. According to Janet Morrison's investigation, a number of other drivers on the same section of Interstate 15 had also reported encounters with duplicate copies of themselves. The best conditions for optical illusions and highway hypnosis were always in the evening, when there was little traffic and the desert landscape provided ideal conditions. Truckers began to refer to the phenomenon as mirror driving, a paranormal phenomenon in which drivers would see exact replicas of themselves and their vehicles, usually in areas where they had experienced significant life events or emotional distress. Due to the combination of isolation, extreme heat, and the mental strain of navigating one of the busiest freight lines in America, Interstate 15 through the Mojave Desert became a focal point for these encounters. Rosa Martinez kept up her trucking business, but she never again drove on Interstate 15 at night when her doppelganger was most likely to show up. Realizing that the isolation and stress of long-haul trucking could lead to circumstances where the line between reality and delusion became dangerously thin, she became an advocate for driver mental health initiatives. She was reminded by her encounter with the mirror driver that America's highways were more than just a means of transportation between cities. They were repositories of human awareness, where memories, fears, and ideas could sometimes take on a life of their own. Throughout the trucking industry, other drivers started reporting similar experiences with duplicate versions of themselves. As a result, support groups and therapy programs were established to help drivers deal with paranormal encounters that made them question their perception of reality. Insurance companies and trucking associations acknowledged the mirror driver phenomenon as a legitimate psychological issue that needed peer support and professional help, making it a recognized occupational hazard. These days, seasoned truck drivers are aware to be wary of cars that closely resemble their own, particularly at night, when the highway's ethereal forces are at their strongest. They understand that the mirrors on California's desert roads reflect more than just light, revealing aspects of drivers, personalities that they would prefer to remain hidden in the background of their work lives. The mirror driver is a reminder that every truck driver has a shadow self that occasionally shows up on the most desolate parts of the U.S. highways, where it is dangerously difficult to distinguish between the driver and the road. The insurance files on the Rosa Martinez case are still open, not because the case is still pending, but rather as a memorial to the mysteries that continue to exist on American roads in spite of scientific and technological advancements. For drivers who spend their careers driving the same routes, her experience with her own mirror image behind the wheel of an identical truck remains a haunting reminder that familiarity and repetition can occasionally lead to situations where reality itself is replicated in ways that call into question the essence of personal identity and existence. "The bridge was crying," she said repeatedly. As Dr. Patricia Hawthorne reviewed the session notes from her most peculiar patient in her 15 years of practice, those were the remarks that reverberated throughout her therapy office. On a regular freight route through West Virginia, Michelle Thompson, a 29-year-old long-haul truck driver from North Carolina, reported what her employer considered to be a serious mental disturbance. As a result, she was sent for mandatory psychological treatment. At first, Michelle's account of her experience on the New River Gorge Bridge on Interstate 77 had sounded like a classic case of driver fatigue and stress-related hallucinations. However, her story's consistency and the tangible proof she offered contradicted conventional theories about what had happened that misty October evening. Michelle Thompson has always been able to pick up on emotional undertones that others might overlook or fail to notice. Days before the family was informed of her dire prognosis, she was able to feel her grandmother's suffering as a toddler. She'd shunned certain buildings and places in high school that weighed heavily on her with inexplicable grief or anger. Michelle had learned to trust her gut feelings about routes and destinations when she first entered the trucking industry 5 years prior. She frequently took detours when her senses cautioned her against going down seemingly normal highways and stopping at truck stops. Throughout her career as a truck driver, her ability to sense emotional atmospheres had come in handy, enabling her to avoid dangerous situations and challenging clients that other drivers encountered without warning. Among dispatchers, Michelle had developed an unofficial reputation for anticipating problems before they became obvious, which encouraged them to put her on loads and routes that had caused problems for other drivers. Like mechanical knowledge or navigational skills that improved her performance as a commercial driver, she saw her supernatural sensitivity as a professional tool. It was intended to be a routine freight run from Charlotte, North Carolina to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, transporting manufactured goods through familiar territory on well-traveled interstate routes. Over the course of her 5-year career, Michelle has made numerous identical drives, following Interstate 77 north through the West Virginia mountains, before joining Interstate 79 for the last approach to Pittsburgh. One of the most remarkable highway crossings in the eastern United States was the New River Gorge Bridge, a magnificent steel arch span that spans the New River 876 feet. Michelle had made innumerable trips across the New River Gorge Bridge without any problems, always appreciating the engineering feat it symbolized and the breathtaking views it provided of the West Virginia mountains. After being completed in 1977, the bridge has grown to become a symbol of the area's natural beauty, drawing tourists and photographers to witness its stunning arch across a deep gorge carved by centuries of river flow through prehistoric Appalachian rock formations. But the circumstances surrounding that October night's approach to the bridge soon roused Michelle's eerie sensitivity. The typical crossing felt like a voyage into an unknown place because of the dense fog that had drifted into the gorge, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards and fostering a sense of loneliness and unease. Even though Michelle's diesel engine was only a few feet away from where she sat, the fog seemed to filter sound in strange ways, producing acoustic effects that made the engine sound hollow and far away. At 2:17 a.m., Michelle's Freightliner Cascadia was approaching the bridge approach when she started to hear what sounded like distant sobbing carried on the fog-laden wind. It was a faint but distinct sound, like the mournful wails of many voices yelling together. At first, Michelle thought the sounds were caused by wind patterns created by the unusual geology of the gorge, but as she continued to the bridge span, the wailing became more audible and emotionally upsetting. Throughout her trucking career, Michelle had seen odd things before, but nothing had prepared her for the level of agony that started to overwhelm her as she crossed the bridge. Anguish, despair, and misery swept over her in waves. She was so overcome by emotions that she was in danger of losing control of her 18-ton vehicle. Somewhere in the fog-shrouded darkness beneath the bridge, the cries became louder and more frequent, as though hundreds of voices were crying at once. With faint strains of military songs and spoken phrases that seemed to float up from the gorge like auditory ghosts from another century, her truck's radio started to pick up what sounded like voices and historical music from the Civil War era. Michelle was able to identify brief speech fragments that made reference to conflicts, deaths, and military actions that were connected to historical occurrences she was familiar with from her high school courses on American history. She was transported to one of the most depressing periods in American history by the acoustic environment created by the voices, which carried the cadence and vocabulary of 19th century speech. After crossing the bridge, Michelle parked her truck at the New River Gorge Bridge overlook and stopped as soon as she could to look into what had caused the unearthly occurrences that had almost paralyzed her during the journey. During the day, the overlook provides an excellent view of the gorge and bridge. However, the fog that night created an impenetrable wall that encased everything farther than a few yards from where she was. The cries persisted, as if they were emanating from the canyon's depths, like the collective suffering of souls trapped in unending grief. Standing at the overlook railing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, Michelle started to notice visual phenomena that contradicted her understanding of the site's background and importance. She saw glimpses of what looked like soldiers in Civil War uniforms through the shifting fog, their spectral forms moving in patterns that mirrored military formations and combat operations along the gorge walls and across the bridge. Because the figurines were translucent and transient, they could only be seen in ideal viewing angles created by sunlight and air conditions. Because of her extraordinary sensitivity, Michelle was able to perceive both the emotional background and the visual manifestations, similar to the agonizing experiences of soldiers who had died far from home during one of America's most devastating conflicts. She felt waves of fear, uncertainty, and extreme despair. The feelings were not her own. Rather, they appeared to be conveyed by the spectral individual she saw, establishing an empathetic bond that enabled her to relive their last moments and their never-ending search for tranquility. When she tried to record her experience, her cell phone, which had been working normally during her trip, started giving strange readings. The camera function took pictures that looked normal on the phone's screen but revealed odd details upon closer inspection. In certain photographs of the bridge and overlook, Michelle was able to identify people wearing period attire that she had not been able to see with her own eyes at the time she took the photos. A visual record of events that had taken place nearly 150 years earlier. The pictures seemed to be of soldiers, some standing at attention and others lying as though injured or dead. Michelle's historical research, conducted at a nearby truck stop equipped with Wi-Fi, revealed the horrific past that accounted for her unearthly experience. Significant Civil War military activity had taken place in the New River Gorge, where Union and Confederate forces fought for control of the railroad lines and river crossings crucial to the region's supply operations. The battles, which raged for months in 1862 and 1863 and claimed thousands of lives, had been particularly bloody. The Fight of New River Bridge, a little-known incident that saw numerous fatalities on both sides as forces fought for control of a wooden train bridge that predated the modern interstate crossing, was the most important discovery Michelle made. Approximately 800 soldiers were killed during the three-day battle, according to historical records, with many of them falling into the gorge as the contested bridge collapsed under the force of frantic infantry charges and artillery bombardment. Many of the dead soldiers were not properly identified, or their families were not notified before they were buried in quick graves around the gorge area. Hundreds of Civil War victims, according to local historians, are still interred in unmarked graves located throughout the area. The earth itself remembers their sacrifice, but official records forget it. Sensitive people like Michelle were able to feel the constant presence of soldiers who had never received a proper burial or recognition for their sacrifice because of the apparent psychic imprint left by the emotional pain of their deaths. Michelle brought tobacco and wildflowers back to the bridge overlook, traditional offerings her Cherokee grandmother had taught her to use in respect for the deceased. Michelle performed a quick ceremony honoring the sacrifice of the Civil War soldiers and requesting their peaceful rest, adhering to the guidelines she had learned for paying respect to ancestral spirits. The sobbing noises that had disturbed her all night started to subside as she finished the ceremony, to be replaced by what sounded like distant voices of relief and gratitude. Michelle was able to fully appreciate the natural beauty of the place, without the supernatural agony that had made her first experience so awful, as the emotional pressure that had threatened to overwhelm her during her bridge crossing completely subsided. As the fog started to clear, the New River Gorge's stunning vista emerged, making the bridge crossing one of Interstate 77's most picturesque sections. The ghostly creatures she had seen before vanished from view, but Michelle could still feel them in the world around her. There were no eerie encounters during Michelle's delivery to Pittsburgh. However, her experience on the New River Gorge Bridge had profoundly changed her understanding of the historical burden that America's roads bear. Finding a network of bridges, mountain passes, and river crossings where sensitive people reported encounters with ghosts from America's horrific past, she carried on researching additional locations where important highways crossed sites of historical trauma. Her therapy sessions with Dr. Hawthorne were incorporated into a broader investigation into the psychological impact of paranormal experiences on professional drivers, which ultimately resulted in the development of support programs for truckers who encountered phenomena that defied accepted notions of reality. For researchers examining the relationship between historical trauma, geographic setting, and personal psychic sensitivity,